We need to free the prisoners. And they would have an army of 10,000 if they could get to them. And that's one of the reasons why the Kurds are not just like, we're not worried about them just because we're...
Yeah, you and I have talked about the Kurds in every podcast we've done so far, but I always say it's like the most fascinating thing to me because they're allied with the United States, which we're like the most powerful country in the world. And there's like 30 million of them, I want to say, something like that, who exist in these no man's lands of Iraq and Syria, particularly that area. And they quite literally have their own bases that you have to have security to get through to get on.
Yeah.
And the only thing they don't have is a bunch of dudes in an office somewhere, maybe at the UN in New York City, drawing lines on a map to say that they're a country.
Yeah.
I don't understand why that hasn't happened at this point.
Yeah, and they're really extraordinary people, and I've spent a bunch of time with them. And what's amazing when you get to meet them is they have very different views about what a military is like. Women have a place. Women are fighters, and they have female units, and they're ferocious. And some of them, people you'd never want to get involved in a fight with. But they have it's a very unique. It's a culture that's just different from anything else that exists in the region. And they have become our friends. We've kept them in power. We've kept them supplied with arms and ability to have autonomy in the region where they exist. And they're the ones that really stand to lose a lot right now, because if there is a future regime in Syria that doesn't have a place for them, and if we don't sort of back them and give them some kind of support, then there's a real question about what happens to them. And it's not just the Kurds that we worry about, but one of the little housekeeping jobs that the Kurds inherited is they have the prisons where all these former ISIS fighters are now. There's one...
They have them.
They have them. So in Kurdish territory, Kurdish-held territory, is something like 10,000 hardcore ISIS fighters who are kept in really big detention camps. And there's another place called Al-Hol, which is where their wives and families and sort of the camp followers that used to be part of ISIS, they're all there now. And they're all basically in huge outdoor prisons, a little more sophisticated than that, with UN and US money providing food and clothing, just humanitarian assistance, because the Kurds can't do it by themselves. And they keep threatening, sort of this one powerful card they have to play is, if you're not backing us anymore, then I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to keep all these prisoners, uncontrolled anymore. There's nothing more that
Release,
ISIS,
go off into the wild.
Right. And there's nothing that ISIS talks about this all the time, but we need to free the prisoners, and they would have an army of 10,000 if they could get to them. And that's one of the reasons why the Kurds are not just like, we're not worried about them just because we're trying to be decent, moral human beings, but because they have a lot. They're controlling a lot in that part of the world that come back to haunt us.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned Turkey. Stick a pin in that, though, for a second, staying just with the Kurds right now. Where were they on November 27th and in the aftermath of this? Are they involved at all in anything on the ground? Are they trying to retain some territory that they could possibly take over for themselves or hold for whoever the Americans say they want to bring in next?
Yeah. So it's very complicated for the Turks because
Kurds.
Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm talking about the Kurds first.
Oh, okay, Kurds
Turks
first.
I want to come to next.
Okay.
Did I say Turks? I'm sorry. I meant to say where are the Kurds during this part of it, and then I was going to get to Turkey.
Okay. So they have, again, a fairly stable area that they're occasionally the Turks and Turkish-backed forces will be involved in a clash on the border.
Right.
So there's that kind of activity that takes place. There's constant counterterrorism efforts by the Kurds. They're always having to kind of put out little fires to ISIS in their region because there are ISIS cells all over that part of Syria, and occasionally they'll attack a Kurdish military base or outpost. But things were, as good as they get for the Kurds. They have control over their own territory. They have kind of an autonomy that had not existed in historical memory. And so it was kind of like the Kurds in Iraq. Once Saddam Hussein fell, the real ones that really benefited were these sort of the Iraqi Kurds, because for the first time they really had the ability to run their own territory in the north of Iraq. So that's where they were, and that's why they're worried that this could go away if things go certain ways.
But meaning, like, when these rebel forces started taking action on the 27th, it wasn't like the Peshmerga was coming in and trying to hold the line or anything. It's like, that's not our fight. This is in a different part of the country. It is what it is.
Yeah, but what you did see was some of the Turkish-backed forces kind of having incursions into their territory, and you saw military clashes and people getting killed because the Turks were trying to make mischief, taking advantage of this sudden vacuum.
Okay.
And so they were getting kind of punched around a little bit then.
All right, yeah, let's get to that, because I know that it's such an interesting part of the story. Because when you read about it, it's like, who are the rebel forces? And it'll list all these different groups, like we already talked about, and then it'll be like, and the Turks. And you're like, wait a minute, isn't that like an act of war to be able to do this if you're a sovereign country in this way, and they are now infiltrating territory? So, you know, what does Erdogan's perfect world look like here? What is he, Erdogan, the leader of Turkey? What is he trying to do?
Well, he's feeling pretty happy right now because he backed HTS, the guys that are running Damascus now.
Oh, he did.
But he also, he had his, Turkish controlled militias that were on the border that were kind of a buffer zone between himself and all the problems in Syria. But he's one of the few international leaders who've come out looking pretty good in this, because even if he can't directly control HTS, he has major influence. This is another Islamist militia of, like many others that he supports, and they've had good relations with the Turks over the years. He's provided money and weapons to them. The HTS folks really came out of the box and surprised everybody, I think, including the Turks. But even if he doesn't, even if HTS isn't his, his horse, he still benefits from their victory. He becomes more powerful, particularly compared to the Iranians and the Russians, who've lost a lot of influence in the last couple of weeks.
And we're going to talk all about Assad in a few minutes here, but what was Erdogan's issues with Assad?
So they really, completely parted ways in the beginning of the Syrian civil war
which was when?
Which was beginning in 2011, with Erdogan supporting many militias that were trying to overthrow Assad. And there were, all kinds of, of clashes along the border. There were huge refugee flows into Turkey, also into other parts of the region. So it was, it's complicated, as these things always are. They have been sworn enemies in the past. In the last couple of years, they've been more accommodating with one another. And a lot of the Arab states saw Bashar as somebody they could negotiate with. And I think Erdogan saw that too, that there was a way to kind of bring order and stability to the region, which is more important to someone like Erdogan than necessarily controlling Damascus. Wasn't one of his objectives. He just wanted a stable border and didn't want to have huge influxes of refugees across into Turkey.
Yeah, he's such a fascinating guy to me, Erdogan, because he's been around forever. You had that famed attempted Turkey coup in like 2016, I want to say, and that got overthrown, and he kind of took more centralized control of power. He's this dude who kind of behaves like a trying to be Western leader in a way, but at the same time wants a more strict adherence to Islam within the country, which, Turkey has always been more secularized in that way. And also, we talk about Syria being a crossroads, which you're absolutely right. Turkey's the country that literally connects Europe and Asia.
That's right.
It's a part of both. It's a bigger country. It's got a bigger GDP, and I guess more to work with in that way.
Yeah.
But, to me, I've always looked at that guy and some of the iron fist that he's used to hold on to rule as someone who has some aspirations, maybe geographically, of like a Putin, right? Like Putin's always kind of wanted to expand Russia into you heard him give his whole history lesson with Tucker Carlson like eight months ago or whatever. But like, it seems like Erdogan in his own way with Turkey, not that he's like invading Italy or something like that, but there's kind of those behaviors in sight that this is a guy who wants to maybe do that if given the opportunity. Do you think that's fair to say?
I think he wants to be the great power in the region, and that's what he's been building up to with this. But he's also been fairly clever about it, both domestically, but also with his relationships with NATO, which Turkey is a part of, which I sometimes forget, but they're a part of NATO, which makes it complicated when we have, Americans backing Kurds who another NATO ally occasionally attacks. So it gets it's a real interesting soup there. But in terms of his domestic politics, one of his my favorite lines that he used was in describing democracy. He said, democracy is like a streetcar. You take it to the destination that you want to go, then you get off and you do whatever the hell you want to do. And that's been his MO. He basically was elected to leadership, and then systematically took apart the opposition. So he's never challenged.
Watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here